All right. So, are you ready to dive into 1970s Rio?
I am.
We've got this screenplay, right? Based on a novel, and it's about this family just living their lives under Brazil's military dictatorship. So picture it, okay? Sunny beaches, vibrant culture, but also like this really heavy shadow of political repression.
Yeah, I can see it.
And we're going to kind of unpack how these like individual lives intersect with, these massive historical events.
It's a really interesting perspective to look at history through.
Yeah.
Like instead of focusing on the larger political movements and all that, we get to see how these very normal people, how they live their lives, these really crazy circumstances.
Totally. So let me introduce you to the Paiva family. Rubens, the dad, he's a former congressman, and he's living under this constant surveillance, right, because of his political views.
Oh, wow.
And Eunice, his wife, she's definitely a force to be reckoned with. Like, you don't want to mess with Eunice.
I gotcha.
And they have 5 kids, each with their own, personality and perspective on this whole crazy situation.
5 kids. That's a lot.
It is, under these circumstances, right? So it all begins with this scene that feels almost like too perfect. The family's having a blast at LeBlanc Beach, kids playing, everyone's relaxing,
Wow.
classic beach day.
I can picture it.
And then, bam!
Oh, no. What happens?
Military helicopters start buzzing overhead.
Wow.
It's such a stark contrast. You've got this idyllic scene, but then this reminder that Big Brother's always watching. What do you think about that juxtaposition?
It's such a smart way to show what it was like to live under a dictatorship. On the surface, everything's beautiful and normal, right? But underneath it all, you can feel this tension, like a fear that's just woven into everyday life. And those helicopters, they're like a symbol of that constant threat, always there.
Totally. And it's not just the helicopters. There's this scene at a checkpoint in a tunnel. Veroka, the oldest daughter, she really gets a taste of how scary and unpredictable the authorities can be. It feels like, foreshadowing, like something bad is going to happen.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That scene is so important.
Yeah.
Because it shows that even the most normal, everyday things, like just driving through a tunnel, could suddenly become terrifying under this kind of regime.
Right. You never knew when you might be stopped, questioned, or worse, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Exactly.
And then, to make things even more complicated, the screenplay brings in this element of leftist groups, right, who are kidnapping foreign ambassadors. So it's not just the simple good guys versus bad guys situation.
Oh, wow.
It's way more complex than that. There are all these different groups, motivations, chaos everywhere. And you can just feel the anxiety building for the Paivas. Are they safe?
Yeah, it really shows how messy things were. It wasn't simple, just black and white. There were all these shades of gray and uncertainty everywhere. No one really felt safe.
Exactly. So in the middle of all this tension, Veroka decides to make a huge decision. She's going to escape to London with some family friends, the Gasparians, who are getting out of this increasingly oppressive climate.
I bet that was hard.
It was really tough on Eunice, Veroka's mom. Obviously, she's worried sick about her daughter's safety. But she knows that staying in Rio, it could be even more dangerous for Veroka.
Yeah, I can see that.
And remember that detail about Eunice giving Veroka her fur-lined coat, the one from her honeymoon? It's like pure symbolism. It was like she was trying to wrap her daughter in love and protection, even though she couldn't physically be there with her.
Wow, yeah. Talk about powerful, huh? That just really shows the sacrifices that parents will make for their children, especially in times like that. Giving away something so important, so meaningful. It takes on this whole new meaning in that situation.
Right. Okay, so while Veroka's preparing to leave, things start going downhill for Rubens, her dad, the former congressman we were talking about, the one who's kind of ostracized for his political beliefs. Things really escalate during Veroka's farewell party at their house.
Oh, no.
It's such a stark contrast. You've got this happy moment, everyone's celebrating Veroka's new adventure, and then boom. The reality of their situation just hits.
Wow.
It starts with these late-night phone calls that Rubens is getting. And then this guy, Dr. Schneider, shows up with his men. And you see Eunice just desperately trying to hold it together while everything's falling apart.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
It's so creepy how they use this seemingly normal excuse, like they're pest control or something, to hide what they're really doing.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
Yeah.
That was a classic tactic these authoritarian regimes would use. They tried to make their actions seem like routine, just everyday business.
Yeah.
But in reality, they were targeting people, silencing them, making them disappear.
Right.
It creates this whole atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. And then no one dares to speak up or resist.
Exactly. And that's what happens to Rubens. He's taken away.
Yeah.
And that's just the beginning of Eunice's ordeal.
Oh, gosh.
It's really rough. She goes through interrogation, imprisonment, being separated from her daughter, and they're constantly putting this psychological pressure on her.
It's just awful.
Yeah. And they refuse to give her any information about Rubens. It's this constant struggle for her, trying to hold on to hope while facing this unimaginable fear.
I bet. And what about that scene in the detention center when she sees the bloodstains on the floor? That really stayed with me. It's like a visual reminder of the violence that was just everywhere during that time.
It's chilling. So what about Eunice's experience stood out to you the most?
Well, what really gets me is how strong and resilient she is, even when she's falling apart. And then on the other hand, there's this growing despair because they won't tell her anything about Rubens. It's so powerful, you know.
It is.
It makes you wonder how people held on to hope when everything around them was designed to crush them.
That's a really tough question, and it's exactly what Eunice is facing.
And the screenplay doesn't hold back. It shows how raw her experience really was. We see her break down, she questions everything, but ultimately she keeps going, keeps fighting.
Then finally she's released and she gets to go home, but it's not really a happy reunion.
Yeah, why not?
Rubens is still missing, and that uncertainty just hangs over them all. And then you get these news reports about this so-called rescue of a prisoner. It's obvious that the regime is trying to cover up what they've done, create confusion.
It's like they're trying to control the story, make it seem like they have everything under control, when it's really the opposite. They're causing even more chaos and fear.
Exactly. And for the Paiva family, it just means they're left with even more questions than before.
It's like a wound that can't heal because they don't even know what happened.
Right. Is he alive or?
It's torture, that not knowing. And so many families went through that during this time.
You realize how much we take for granted, just knowing where our loved ones are, being able to talk to them.
It's a huge reminder of how important these basic freedoms are. These are things that so many people were denied during this time.
So Eunice is back home, but she's not done fighting, not even close. She's dealing with everything she's been through, the constant surveillance, the legal battles to try to find out what happened to Rubens. Plus, she has to be there for her kids, who are also completely affected by all of this.
Wow, that's a lot to deal with. I was really struck by how they showed the impact of all of this on the kids. They had to grow up so fast, deal with things that no child should ever have to.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the emotional impact either. Their whole lives were constantly disrupted. Their home, their routine, their sense of security, everything. They're living under a microscope, always being watched.
It must have been exhausting.
Totally. And that's where we see Eunice really transform. She was always strong, but now she's driven by this fierce determination to find out the truth about Rubens.
I could see that.
She's channeling all that pain, all her anger, all that fear into action.
Yeah.
She becomes an advocate, not just for her family, but for everyone who was silenced and hurt by the regime. She's not going to be a victim.
Good for her.
And then there's this really symbolic scene where the family dog gets run over. It just felt like this very raw image of the impact the dictatorship had on their lives, like this crushing weight.
It's a powerful image. The loss of innocence, everything being disrupted, the feeling of being threatened all the time.
And what about Eunice burying the dog? What did you think about that?
It struck me as her way of taking back some control in a situation where she felt powerless. She couldn't control what happened to Rubens, but she could control this one small act. It's like she's trying to bury the pain, the fear, the uncertainty right along with that dog.
It's a poignant image, isn't it? Like she's trying to find some kind of closure, some way to move forward, even though she knows the fight's far from over.
Totally. It just shows the resilience of people. Even when things are so terrible, we find ways to cope, to grieve, to heal.
Okay, so we've seen Eunice go through imprisonment, come home to this constant struggle. But the story doesn't end there. It jumps ahead to 1996, years after the dictatorship is over. Now, you might be thinking, what's the point of that? Why not just stick with the aftermath of Rubens' disappearance?
Well, I think that jump is really important because it shows that just because the dictatorship ended doesn't mean the trauma went away or that everyone just forgot about what happened.
Yeah.
It shows how much impact the dictatorship had, even years later.
Yeah. It's like a scar, right? It never really goes away. It's a reminder of that trauma that still affects their lives. And not just theirs, but so many others who lived through that time.
Exactly. It shows that just because a country becomes a democracy doesn't mean everything magically goes back to normal. The pain, the loss, the questions, they're still there for the Paiva family, even in this new, supposedly free Brazil.
It's so easy to think that everything just goes back to normal, right? But this screenplay shows us that it's just not that simple.
And it's not just the emotional scars either, right? We see how the dictatorship's impact is still felt in things like who owns land, economic inequality, even the way people talk about politics.
Yeah.
It's like this ghost of the dictatorship is still there in the background, shaping things in ways we don't always see.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And even visually, right? We go from these sunny beaches of Rio to this modern city, São Paulo.
It's like a visual representation of how much Brazil has changed, but also how it can't fully escape its past.
And speaking of shadows, what do you think about Babu's decision to become a lawyer? To fight for justice? Do you think that's directly because of what happened to her family?
It's hard to know for sure, but I think it's safe to say that her experiences under the dictatorship had a huge impact on her, like on her values and her passion for social justice. She's dedicated her career to exposing the truth about the regime's crimes. It's like she's carrying on what her mother started.
Right.
Fighting for accountability, acknowledging everyone's suffering, and maybe even finding some closure for her family and for the whole country.
And what's so powerful is that she's not alone in this. There's a whole generation of Brazilians doing this work, uncovering the truth about the dictatorship, trying to make sure something like that never happens again.
It's a reminder that justice doesn't happen overnight. It takes time and effort from a lot of people, and often it falls on the shoulders of the next generation to keep fighting. Babu represents those people, the ones trying to confront the past and make a better future.
And Eunice. Well, she's still amazing. She's working with indigenous communities, fighting land grabs, speaking out against injustice. It's like she's found a way to turn all that pain and anger into something positive.
It's incredible. It shows her belief in truth and justice, even after everything she's been through. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's still hope, and it's worth fighting for.
Then finally, after all those years of searching and fighting and holding on to hope, she gets Ruben's death certificate. It's like closure in a way, but also so sad.
It's a victory, but it's bittersweet. It tells her he's gone, but it doesn't answer all the questions. It's just a stark reminder of the human cost of all of this, the impact it has on people, on families.
Yeah. And that final scene, the photo shoot, it's like a mini version of the whole story. You see the kids laughing, finding joy even after all of that. But then Veroka, she can't smile. It shows how we all deal with trauma differently.
And that question the photographer asks, when did you bury him? It stays with you.
Yeah,
it makes you think about how the Paiva family, they never really got to grieve properly. It was an ongoing process for them.
It's like a reminder that the past can really affect us and that healing takes time and patience and being willing to face those painful memories.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot, from those sunny Rio beaches to the darkness of the dictatorship. We've seen the Paiva family go through so much. But the screenplay doesn't end there.
It doesn't.
Nope. It leaves us with this really thought-provoking scene.
I can't wait to hear about it.
Me too.
So, one thing that really got to me in this screenplay is how they use visuals to show these really complicated emotions, like that dog getting run over, or the empty lot where they were supposed to build the new house. It all just points to this feeling of loss, this disruption from the dictatorship. What do you think about that?
Oh, yeah, totally. Those images, they stick with you. It's like they go straight to your heart, You really feel the weight of what's happening, maybe even more than words can sometimes.
Right. And speaking of emotional weight, Eunice's strength through all of this is incredible. She's obviously falling apart inside, but somehow she manages to hold her family together, deal with the legal stuff, stand up to the authorities.
She's like a warrior, fighting for her family and for what's right, even when everything is against her. I think a lot of people would find her story really inspiring.
Absolutely. But I think it's important to remember that just because she's strong doesn't mean she isn't hurting. She's going through so much grief and trauma. But she finds a way to use that pain, to fight for justice, not just for Rubens, but for everyone who was hurt by the regime. It makes you wonder, where does that kind of strength even come from?
That's a great question. And honestly, I don't know if there's a simple answer. It could be her love for her family, her belief in justice, maybe even just refusing to let the dictatorship break her.
That's a really insightful point. It shows how complex we are as humans, how we can find strength even in the darkest times.
And talking about dark times, one thing that really hit me was how they showed time passing in the screenplay. We see the family struggling with Rubens being gone, and then all of a sudden it's 1996, years after the dictatorship. It felt jarring at first, like, wait, what just happened? But then it made me think, Why do you think they structured the story that way?
It's interesting, right? And I think it's because that time jump makes a really crucial point. Just because a country becomes a democracy doesn't mean the trauma is gone, or that the people who were lost come back. The past can affect people for decades. What do you think that means for people listening? Why is this time jump so important?
You're totally right. It's easy to think that once a dictatorship ends, everyone just moves on and things go back to normal. But the screenplay shows us that's not true. The trauma, the loss, the questions, they all stay with the Paiva family, even in this new, free Brazil.
It shows that healing takes time. It's not just something that happens overnight. And for a lot of people who live through those times, it's a process that continues even decades later.
And it's not just emotional scars either, right? We see how the dictatorship still affects things like land ownership, economic inequality, even the way people talk about politics. It's like the dictatorship is still there, behind the scenes, shaping things in ways we don't always notice.
You're right. It's like it's lurking in the shadows. And even visually, when we jump to 1996, it's different. Now we're in this modern city, São Paulo, which is a total contrast to those beaches and the nature we saw in Rio.
Right. It's like a visual way of showing how Brazil has changed, but it's still connected to its past. It can't escape it.
It's like a visual metaphor.
So what do you think about Bob Yu becoming a lawyer, the one who fights for justice? Do you think that's because of what happened to her family?
Well, it's tough to say for sure. But I do think her experiences under the dictatorship had a big impact on her, on what she cares about, her passion for justice. She's chosen a career where she exposes the truth about what the regime did. In a way, she's continuing the fight that her mother started,
Right.
fighting for accountability, acknowledging the suffering people went through, and maybe even helping her family and the country find some peace.
And what's really powerful is that there are others like her, a whole generation of Brazilians trying to uncover the truth, make sure something like this never happens again.
Yeah, it shows that the fight for justice takes a long time, a lot of effort from lots of people. And often it's the next generation that has to keep going. Bobby Yu represents that next generation trying to deal with the past and create a better future.
And Eunice, well, she's still amazing. She's working with indigenous communities, challenging land grabs, speaking out against injustice. She's turned all that pain and anger into something good, something that helps others.
Her activism shows how much she believes in truth and justice, even after everything she's been through. It's a reminder that even when things are really bad, there's still hope, and it's worth fighting for.
And then after years of searching, fighting, holding on to hope, she gets Ruben's death certificate. In a way, it gives her some answers, but it's also really sad.
It's a victory, but it's bittersweet, right? It tells her he's gone, but it doesn't answer every question. It's just a reminder of how many people were hurt by this, the impact it had on families.
And that last scene with the photo shoot, it's like a mini version of the whole story, isn't it? The kids are laughing, finding joy even after everything. But then there's Veroka, she can't smile. It just shows that everyone deals with trauma differently,
And that question, the one the photographer asks, when did you bury him? That really stays with you. It makes you realize that for the Paiva family, they never really got to say goodbye. It was a process that kept going.
It's a reminder that the past can have a huge impact on us, and healing takes time, patience, and facing those painful memories.
It's not easy.
So we've talked about a lot, from those sunny beaches in Rio to the darkness of the dictatorship. We've seen how much the Paiva family went through. But the story doesn't end there.
It doesn't?
Nope. It leaves us with this thought-provoking scene.
I can't wait to hear about it.
I know, me too. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, one thing that really gets me is that final question, that when did you bury him? It just makes you think about the Paiva family and all the other families who lost people and how they deal with this grief that's so complicated and, I don't know, just never really resolved.
Yeah.
What does it even mean to bury someone when you never really had the chance to mourn them?
It's such a heavy question, right? And the screenplay doesn't really give us any easy answers. It's something that people in entire countries struggle with after these really traumatic things, especially when it involves political violence, people disappearing. Like, how do you find closure when there's so many questions that never get answered?
Yeah, it's like the Paiva family is carrying around this weight, this grief that nobody talks about, and it affects their lives even though the dictatorship's over. And it's not just them, right? It feels like the screenplay is hinting at this much bigger story, like a whole country trying to deal with this really traumatic past.
You're so right. It's not just one family's story. It's about how the dictatorship affected everyone, the whole society. And it asks these really tough questions about how we deal with history, how we face those injustices, and how we can heal and move forward.
And the thing is, the screenplay doesn't try to give us all the answers. It leaves us with more questions, which I think is good, actually. It makes us really think about these things, to see how complex history is, and to realize there's no easy fix for dealing with this kind of trauma and loss, especially for a whole country.
I agree. It's not about finding a perfect solution. It's about recognizing how much these events changed things and creating a space for people to talk, remember, and hold each other accountable.
And speaking of remembering, we should say that this screenplay is based on a true story. The novel I'm Still Here by Marcelo Rubens Paiva, it tells his own family story during the dictatorship. And if you're more into movies, there's a film version too, directed by Walter Sells.
Both of them, the book and the movie, they give you a much deeper look into this time in Brazil and the price people paid for this political repression. They're definitely worth checking out if you want to learn more.
For sure. They show you a side of things that a lot of people might not know about, and they remind us that it's important to remember these things, to learn from the past.
And it's not just about learning from the past, These stories can inspire us to think about what we're doing now and what we want the future to be. They ask us, what can we do to prevent this from happening again? How can we promote justice and make sure people are held accountable?
It's like a call to action. To be aware, to speak up against things that are wrong, to work toward a world where everyone's rights are respected and protected.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that even when things seem really dark, people can still find a way to survive. And that hope for a better future, is always something worth fighting for.
So this deep dive, it's been a real emotional roller coaster. From those moments of hope to the really dark parts, and finally, seeing how resilient people can be. It's been incredible.
It really has. It's a story that stays with you. It makes you realize how powerful stories can be. They can show us these difficult truths and inspire us to make the world a better place, a more just and caring place.
And for everyone listening, we leave you with this. What does it really mean to face the past? For ourselves and for the whole country. How do we make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of history? How do we create a future where everyone can live with dignity and freedom?
These are huge questions, but they're worth thinking about. Keep exploring these things. Keep the conversation going.